Good morning and welcome to another Boca bearing video. Today's video is not a bearing installation video, it's a bearing removal video utilizing the miniature bearing puller set offered by Boca. Now this is a fantastic set of tools that enables you to remove a wide variety of different bearings. I'll be showing it and demonstrating how I used it to remove a camshaft bearing on my Enya 4-stroke engine. Okay, so here on the table I've got the 17-piece bearing puller set from Boca. This is it. It comes in this beautiful case, and I'm opening it up this way because things tend to fall out if I open it the other way. I think I'm going to need to zoom out just a hair here to try and get all of this in here. So this is what the kit looks like, and it's got this section here are larger chucks for larger bearings, and then this here is really the miniature set of bearings here. Now this is what the outer sleeve looked like, and it kind of shows all the miniature bearings here, and it says it's covered, or it removes 3mm, 4mm, 5 and 6mm ID bearings. And here is a nice set of instructions on exactly how you use this tool, and I'm going to show you more closely these instructions. So what I have here is I was provided with this chuck here, and now I'm going to zoom back in some. This receiver chuck. Now these receiver chucks and this whole set of bearings is designed on the principle where you've got a portion that will engage in the ID, or the inner diameter of the bearing, but the collet or the chuck itself is split. And then you have a needle chuck that you actually screw in here, and as you screw that in, it flares out that receiver chuck and grips the bearing. So what I've got here is, this is a camshaft bearing from an OS engine, a surpass engine. So before I would screw this in, I would engage this bearing in here and then screw this all the way in. And now it's locked this bearing into place. So once you've got that done, you can do it with or without the handle installed. Now this handle, the pull handle, comes with an adapter, but the adapter is really not necessary in this application. So you can screw this on first, and then put your receiver chuck on, and then screw your, and basically all you do then is you just pull on this handle and remove the bearing. Now that is much easier said than done, because most of the bearings that are in RC glow engines are press fit, and of course if you're replacing the bearing, it's probably been heat cycled many times in there, so it's going to be very difficult to remove. So I'm going to get into exactly what I had to do to remove this bearing on my Enya 4-stroke engine, the camshaft bearing in the timing case. But one of the things I need to mention here is this was I believe this was the 5mm chuck. Well, the ID of these OS camshaft bearings, and even the bearing that I had, was in between, the bearing that was in the Enya engine was in between 4mm and 5mm. So what I ended up having to do was I had to use a Dremel tool with a sanding disc on it and just very gently mill down the outer lip, the grabbing portion of this, to about 4.94mm. I believe that's the measurement that I did, and that enabled me to be able to get it installed in these bearings, but then still also have enough material there to, when it's fully engaged here, to be able to hold the bearing tight enough to pull it out. So now let me show you exactly how I did this on my engine. So before I actually demonstrate the removal of this bearing, I want to show you where this bearing is located, how it stacks up in the engine, and why it's important that this particular bearing in these Enya engines really gets replaced. So I've got a sample Enya engine here. This is not the 46 4-cycle that I took apart, obviously. This happens to be my Enya 80 4-cycle engine, but all of the 4-cycle engines from Enya are the same design and platform. So the timing gear that I'm referring to when I say that, and that particular bearing, this is the timing case on this engine. That bearing resides in the very back of the timing case, right here, at the very bottom. So it is in line with the main crankshaft. It doesn't sit above the crankshaft as in OS Surpass engine. So this is going to have the same rotational, essentially the same rotational speed as the main crankshaft. But I'll get into that a little bit more here in a moment. So let me set this engine aside. And I've got the crankshaft here. Let me zoom in just a hair more here. I've got the crankshaft here and the timing wheel. Now, what will be on here is this bearing that I'm going to be removing is a very small one within the timing case. And that's the one that engages here. Now, there is another bearing. This is a double ball bearing supported shaft. And that other bearing will ride up in there. So basically, when this thing is all assembled, and this timing shaft has a hole in it, that hole facilitates just the end of the crankshaft. So as you can see, as this crankshaft rotates, it's going to spin this bearing. Now, because of the offset of the center line of the crankshaft and where this bearing is, I don't believe that that bearing spins at the exact same speed, but this one certainly does. So that's the case, and that's the size of the bearing that I'm going to be removing. And here is the bearing set for these two things. The one that goes in here and the bearing that resides on this timing shaft. And the kit number is CSK001. Now this particular kit number, and there'll be a link to this description, or to this set of bearings in the video description. Now this set of bearings actually will fit both, or fit all of the following sizes of Enya 4-stroke engines. The 46, the 46-2, the 53, the 60, and the 80. The ones for the 90 and 120, 155 are slightly larger because they're much larger engines. So with that said, now let me put my vise on the table and I'll show you how I remove this bearing. So now I've got my desk vise on the table. I've got the handle, receiver chuck, and needle chuck, but not fully squeezed together yet. And I've got my timing case here. Now the reason I have this vise here is just simply to hold this case, because what I found when I did this the first time, and I've repressed this bearing in slightly for this demonstration, but as I said with these glow engines, these are very tightly press fit. So what I ended up having to do to actually get this bearing out the first time, it was a little bit more painful than you would think, or what I'm going to demonstrate here. But it's also better than the means that I've used before. In that, what I had to do is I had a plastic container that was filled with water, and then I froze that solid. And I would heat this up a lot with oil in there, and then I'd set this in the ice and cool it. So I was thermal shocking the whole case and the bearing several times, about 5 or 6 times. I'd go really, really hot, stick it in the ice and let it cool down as cool as it was going to get, and then heat it up again. And that's what enabled me to actually pull this bearing out. So the other means that I've used for many years to extract these bearings is quite painful, and it can be very problematic to your hand and the actual case itself. And that is, you basically do the same thing I just said. You thermal cycle it, but you have to wear like a really good protective heat resistant glove, and then you have a piece of wood that you put on a very, very, very firm surface, not this table that kind of bounces up and down. It's got to be a piece of wood on concrete or something, and what you would do is essentially just slam this thing back and forth many times until the bearing would drop out. It works, but it takes a lot of time, and it takes its toll on your hand and all of that type of thing. Plus the fact that this bearing is so lightweight, it's such a small bearing that it takes a lot of inertia and then an immediate stop to even begin to make that want to fall out of this case. So that's where heat cycles, heating and cooling help to loosen that up, but I would always remove it on a heat cycle. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you here. So I've got my 5mm chuck here that I ground down to 4.94 millimeters. It's not fully inserted in the needle chuck. I'm just going to insert it into the bearing. Clicked in place, and now I'm just going to tighten this thing down. And just that act of tightening that expanded those chuck jaws just enough to grip this bearing. So now what I'm going to do is I'll just lightly put this in here. And what I had to do the first time is it was a lot of back and forth wiggling and moving back and forth, and then I take this whole thing out and set it in an ice bath and then heat it up again. But here, since I've only got this bearing partially installed, it should just be a matter of just wiggling it around a bit, and then the bearing comes out, just like you see there. So that's the methodology for how you do it. As I said, doing it for the first time on a bearing is much more challenging just because of how press fit it is. And the other thing is how much space is beneath the bearing to facilitate full engagement over the lip of the bearing, so that you're really pinching, or it's expanding when it's on the outside, when it's expanding as it's already through the bearing, and not expanding or trying to expand in the center of the bearing. And without really knowing, you know, how deep that is, you're not really sure how it's going to happen. So that's why I didn't film this the very first time I did it, because it was painstaking and it took quite a bit of effort, but it was a heck of a lot better than the heat slam method, I guarantee you, because my hand is not damaged or hurt and the bearing is out. So that's how I used this miniature bearing puller set from Boca to remove this bearing. Now, this bearing is one that's super critical to replace anytime you're doing a bearing replacement or refurbishment of these engines, just because of the fact that in your engines, because this sits at the very back of the engine, they get very little lubrication. And they do get some lubrication, but these timing cases tend to be an area that really gets carameled up, gets a lot of dried fuel residue or dried oil, and a lot of times, depending on how bad the condition of the engine is, you can get a lot of rust in there. So all of those things make it such that that's a very difficult bearing to remove, but this tool makes that job so much easier. So thank you for watching.